Now, a subtitle for the book of Haggai might be this: what is the secret of blessing? Haggai gives us the answer. What is the secret of knowing God's blessing? Well, we know that simply believing is not enough, because these people in Haggai's day, they didn't doubt that God existed. They believed in him, but there were lots of times when they didn't know his blessing. Half-hearted following of God is not enough either to know God's blessing in your life. Now, I know that from being a pastor, because I know there are plenty of defeated Christians around because they're half-hearted and they end up not knowing God's blessing and feeling defeated. It's not enough either simply to turn to God in a crisis. When things go wrong, you say, God, please help me. And you expect God to step in. And then when things are all right, you go back to your old ways. That is not enough to know God's blessing. It's not enough either simply to be a Christian on Sunday. That's not enough to know God's blessing. I don't know whether any of you remember a children's song. I remember it, and maybe Andy and Kirsty will remember this one. There used to be a song that went like this: put Jesus in your everyday life. Do you know that one? Put Jesus in your everyday life, not just Sundays or Wednesdays, but all the in-between days. Put Jesus in your everyday life. It's a brilliant song. Absolutely true. Because being a Christian just on Sunday or just on Wednesday is not enough to know God's blessing. Now, we find that in the book of Haggai, because the people in Haggai's day were doing all of those things. Half-hearted, just believing in God. They were turning to God in a crisis and not the rest of the time. They were just Christian believers at particular points. It's not enough. They fail to know God's blessing. Haggai will tell us this: if you really, really want to know God's blessing in your life, really, nothing less than total devotion to him. Nothing less than dedicated following of him. Nothing less than absolute obedience to his word. Don't hold back on following God, on being obedient to him, even when you might think that it'll make you more miserable. If you want to know God's blessing, that's what's required. Now, we know that God's people here in Haggai's day were missing out on his blessing, because we find that in the first 11 verses of chapter 1. Just cast your minds back for a moment. God speaks through Haggai to the people, and he says the temple lies in ruins, and you're concentrating on your houses, and you are not getting God's blessing as a result. Were they turning away from God? No. Were they wholeheartedly devoted to God? No. They were giving God a little bit. Oh, they built the foundations of the temple. They were laid, but then they turned their minds elsewhere. They turned their eyes and their minds back on themselves, and as a result, they were missing out. And God says to Haggai, tell them they're missing out. We know from Haggai that they made required changes to their life and their actions. They obeyed God, and things changed. Chapter 1 and verse 12, the second half of that chapter, tells us that they were obedient to God, and things began to change. First part of chapter 2, we saw last time, we see how God then encouraged them to keep going. He encouraged them. They knew God's blessing when they stepped out for him in total dedication. So now in this second part of chapter 2, we're getting very close to the end of this very short little book of prophecy. There's one left next week, just the end bit. But in the section before us this evening, God reminds the people of three things. They've had this experience of not putting God fully at the centre, changing to put God fully at the centre and knowing God's blessing. God reminds them of what they were. He then reminds them of what they've become. And he then reminds them of what they have in store. What they were, what they've become, and what they have in store. So as we turn to Haggai chapter 2 and verse 10, we've got one of these dates again. The dates in Haggai are really interesting. Chapter 10 and verse 1, it's not an inconsequential verse, it's important. On the 24th day of the 9th month in the second year of Darius. I'm sure you know that was December the 18th, 520 BC. There you go, very important, almost Christmas, but then it couldn't have been Christmas, could it, because Jesus hadn't yet been born. So, 18th of December, 520 BC. And the word of the Lord came to Haggai. Now, if you look back, you'll find that's 2 months after Haggai's prophecy at the beginning of chapter 2. And it's 3 months after Haggai's prophecy right at the very beginning of the book. Now, this is the last date we get in the book. What does that tell us other than Haggai's ministry lasted 3 months? That's not very long, is it? It's not very long to make a splash, but he seemed to manage it. 3 months, and the people turned around because of what he had to say. The lessons that they learned were important. But the thing is, it doesn't take years and years of practice to get it right, does it? It doesn't take necessarily the 66 chapters of Isaiah or the, whatever it is, 47 is it, of Ezekiel. Or it doesn't take that long. Haggai's got 2 chapters and 3 months, and the people turn around. Now that's a real encouragement, isn't it? Because if we think we haven't quite got it right, we read this and we say, well, if they can do it in 3 months, so can we. It doesn't take long. What it does take is dedication. And it takes obedience. And it takes a determination to act. A willingness to change. To go where God leads. That's one thing that we see from these dates. Just 3 months. So God reminds them, verse 11, what they were without God. Let's have a look at verse 11. Thus says the Lord of hosts, ask the priests about the law. Haggai is instructed by God to talk to the priests. Notice that there's no Zechariah here this time, and there's no Zerubbabel. It's just the priests, Joshua and the priests. Why is that? Because this question was aimed at them. They were the professionals. They should know the answer. It was an answer about the ritual in their law. A question about the ritual in their law, wasn't it? Here's the question, verse 12. If someone carries holy meat in the fold of his garments and touches with his fold bread or stew or wine or oil or any kind of food, does it become holy? In other words, you have something holy, you touch something that's not holy. Does the thing that is not holy get holiness from the thing that is holy? It's self-evident. The priests say no. And that's right, of course. It's self-evident. So how about the other way round? Verse 13. Haggai said, if someone who is unclean by contact with a dead body touches any of these, does it become unclean? So here we've got an unclean person now who's become ritually unclean, for example, by contact with a dead body. If they touch something that's ritually clean, what happens? well, the thing that's ritually clean becomes unclean. That's the way the law works. And the priests answered and said, it does become unclean. They got it right. Now, it's self-evident, really, isn't it? Think of it this way. If I have a sink full of potatoes covered in soil, and I peel the potatoes, do they become clean because my hands are clean? Or do my hands become soily because the potatoes are soily? Well, of course, it's a ridiculous question, isn't it? What about if you're mending a leaky U-bend in your sink and you get all over your hands? You have to wash your hands afterwards because your hands get mucky and dirty and unclean. You don't get a clean U-bend because you put clean hands. It's self-evident, isn't it? When you're planting out seedlings, if you do that kind of thing in the spring, you put your seedlings out, you get muck on your hands. The soil doesn't get clean, your hands become dirty. It's self-evident, isn't it? If I run my finger down the side of my car at this time of year, my finger gets incredibly dirty. It doesn't make the car clean. It's self-evident. And so that is right, God says, verse 14, Haggai answered and said, or God said through Haggai, so it is with this people and with this nation before me, declares the Lord, and so with every work of their hands, and what they offer there is unclean. One little bit makes a whole lot unclean. What's the point here that Haggai is making? Here it is. Sometimes we can think that a little bit won't really matter. Sometimes we think that maybe a wrong word here, just one, or a bad attitude there, or a little dishonesty, that won't matter. It won't make any difference. Well, according to Haggai, it will. It will. God says it all matters. Any involvement in sinful ways, God says, pollutes the people. And it doesn't work the other way around. God destroys the idea here that there is a distinction, says one commentator, between secular and sacred. I don't know if you saw that. Look at verse 14 again, the second half of verse 14. So with every work of their hands, and what they offer there is unclean. Every work of their hands. It's not just if they compromise a little bit on their beliefs that it wrecks their worship. It's not just that by a wrong word here, a small word here and a small attitude there, that it affects their worship. It affects the entirety of their life, says God. Their entire life. The distinction between sacred and secular is so often just a myth. We are people. We are whole people. And we can't compartmentalize one and the other. We are people. So if we disobey God in one area, it affects the whole of our life, says Haggai. One commentator says this, which I think is really helpful. Haggai is challenging both the concept of a purely secular society and the notion that their religious activity is self-validating. If people are not right with God, their society will reflect their character, not change it. See, the point is this: if you want a society that works well, it needs to be right with God. A secular society that ignores God will never work. That's what they were, trying to live just keeping God at arm's length. So what had they become with God? What they became with God, verse 15 to 19 here. Twice in this section, God asks the people to consider something. That is, to think hard about something, to sit down and meditate on it and work this out. So, consider, first of all, verse 15. Consider from this day onward, before stone was placed upon stone in the temple of the Lord, how did you fare? In other words, when you had no temple, before you'd started building the temple, how did you get on? How did it go for you? God is asking the people to answer the question for themselves. Look back, consider it, think about it. How did it go for you? The answer is, it didn't go well. Verse 16, how did you fare? When one came to a heap of 20 measures, there were only but 10. When one came to the wine vat to draw 50 measures, there were but 20. Life was not good when God was not at the heart of what they were doing. But look at this, because this is important. Verse 17, I struck you and all the products of your toil with blight and with mildew and with hail, yet you did not turn to me, declares the Lord. Who's doing the striking? It is God. See, their struggle and their difficulties is not passive. This is God doing this, causing this, because they were rejecting him. Now that's quite hard to get your head around, but there it is in black and white. The implication there, of course, is that God was doing these things to encourage them to turn back to him. But he says here, even though he did those things, they didn't turn back to him. When God was not central to all that they did, Haggai says, when God was not central to all that you do, the people listening to them. See, the temple represented the presence of God. No temple meant no God. That's the picture here. No temple means no God. No matter how many religious ceremonies they had without the temple, they weren't good enough. The commentator again says, ceremonies without the house was religion without God. Because God was not in it. It was empty ceremony. Empty. And whatever devotion the people offered, if it was empty and without God, it was worthless, wasn't it? Worthless. Things did not go well. And then Haggai says, consider, again, look at verse 18. Consider from this day forward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, you'll notice that's the same date as in chapter 10. So it's saying from this point, something changed. Since the day that the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid, they put God back at the center. This date, the 24th day of the 9th month in the year of Darius, is totally insignificant. There was no great festival or anything significant happening. It wasn't a seed time, it wasn't a harvest time. It was just a date. But for the people of God here, it was a date that gained deep significance, because it was a date when they returned to God and when God returned to them in blessing. When you committed to put God at the centre, things went better, didn't they? Says God through Haggai. Committing themselves to building was testimony that the Lord mattered, says one commentator. When they committed themselves to building the temple, they were saying, yes, the Lord matters to me. It was costly to build the temple. not only financially costly, but costly in terms of time and costly in terms of opposition. It was no easy thing to be building the temple with the opposition that was around them. But it showed that the Lord mattered to them more than those other things. The building of the temple is the divinely required precondition of the indwelling of God among his people. The unbuilt house speaks of unwanted residents. When they don't commit to building God's house, they're saying, God, I don't really want you. Or at least, I want you in word, but not in action. Their problem was that they acted as if life could be run without reference to God, and so as if grace would be theirs, even though they neglected the means of grace. How can God bless us if we're not committed to him? How can we expect God's grace if we neglect him, the means of grace? And so they changed. Their lives changed around on that date. I'm sure that date would have been fixed in their minds after that. The 24th day of the 9th month, the 18th of December. That's what they were. That's what they'd become. What have they in store with God then? Verse 19, here's another. Consider. Consider. Is the seed yet in the barn? Indeed, the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, and the olive trees have yielded nothing. But from this day, I will bless you. Isn't that the most amazing promise from God? These people have hardly been model believers, have they? Just like us. You know, we all fall many times. That's why we say the confession at the beginning of every service. We're hardly model believers. But when they turned around in Haggai and committed themselves wholly to God, put God at the centre, whatever the cost may be, God says, I will bless you. We need to recognise that this is not a prosperity gospel. We need to recognise that this is not God saying, if you do all these things for me, then I'll give you lots of wealth and money and prosperity. That's not the point. Trust in God and you'll be rich. Well, experience of many people shows that that is not necessarily the case. But it is a spiritual prosperity gospel. See, if we trust in God, put him at the heart of everything, every day, every moment, he promises to bless us. That's spiritual prosperity, isn't it? Whatever goes on in our lives, if God is blessing us, what more could we want? Trust in God and you will be blessed. Now the question at the end of all this, because what Haggai is doing really, he's reflecting on what's gone before. You know, they're not building the temple, they're rebuilding the temple and the encouragement of God. He's reflecting on what that means. It's a good opportunity for us to reflect where we are and what our commitment to God is like. Whether it's wholehearted, whether we just follow God when we think we need something, or whether we just turn to God in a crisis. It's worth reflecting on those things. Is God at the heart of everything you do? Not just church life, everything. Because there's no sacred secular distinction. Everything. The people needed to learn that. They learned that and God blessed them beyond measure. So where are you? Is your spiritual life a little bit dull? Are you not experiencing God's blessing in the way that you believe you should according to what the Bible says? Maybe you need to come to God on your knees and ask him to show you why that's the case, what you need to do, how you need to change. Because if God is at the centre, you have his promise of blessing. Let's bow our heads to pray.